everyone. I have to re-record this chapter because I have some issue with audio and video going the same. So I'm hoping that this recording is no issue. And we'll see if it works. And if not, I'll figure something out. So this is chapter 7, Cut Off from the Neck Down, from Mindsight by Dr. Dan Siegel. And again, I'm going chapter by chapter. So this chapter focuses on a patient who had lost her mom at a very young age. And after she lost her mom, her father remarried. And there were stepkids, and there was a lot of unfair treatment and, basically feeling like mean stepmom syndrome. And also she was cut off from her maternal grandparents. So I'm not sure if that means they moved far away or that the father just kind of didn't want to have anything to do with them. I'm not quite sure. However, this equals trauma. And so when you have something in your life that occurs, especially even if it's early childhood, this kind of trauma is going to have lasting effects. And this is a shout out to my friend Ariana, who runs Hello Trauma, that you can look up if you're interested in more work on trauma. You can join her classes or community. I think she does a fantastic job with that. So check her out at Hello Trauma. So when this happened, his patient basically said to herself, you know what? I'm just not going to feel emotions anymore. I'm all done. It's not worth it. It's too painful. I'm kind of done with getting sucked into all of these emotions. And I don't really have a time when it feels good. So I'm just not going to feel, basically, is her coping mechanism as an 11-year-old. So doing that, she avoids all of the feelings, right? She shuts down her emotions and basically cuts herself off vertically from the neck down, right? So she's just not taking in any sort of information that's going up to her cortex to be evaluated. She's not processing that anything as an emotion. She's basically just going through life and the emotions of all these things. And this was one of the great quotes that I wrote down. So basically, she did not have awareness, right, of anything that was going on. So she experiences life, and she did get married. She did have kids of her own. However, she kind of has this separateness, if you will. She's separated from them in a very real way because she doesn't want to associate experience and emotion, right? Like, she's done that her whole life. And so it makes it really hard to connect with someone else. Now, Dan Siegel said this, and I think this is beautiful. He said, just because you don't deal with emotions that are there, it doesn't mean that they don't have an effect on you. That's a big statement. Basically, what he's saying is you can choose to cope by not dealing with the emotions. But somewhere in your body, those emotions are still occurring and they still have an effect. And I want you to know, I have several friends who we've had discussions about emotional trauma, and they'll say, well, I just don't deal with it. I'm over it. It doesn't affect me. And what that means is you are choosing not to deal with the effect, right? It doesn't mean it doesn't have an effect on you. I can almost guarantee that it has some effect on you. It's very interesting. So Dan goes on and he's talking about, I have copious amounts of notes, so you'll have to apologize, or I have to apologize. So you have to just deal with me looking down at my notes. We deal with things as they come up and how we know best to cope. So as I said before, it's a coping mechanism, and it's very clear in his patient that she decided to do this because it was too painful to deal with and she didn't feel like she had support. So if you're feeling like you don't have support, it's really difficult to process through emotions. This is why I'm a big proponent of having a support person, whether that's a coach, which is something I do, whether that's a therapist, whether it's a psychologist, whatever. You have to have support in a safe space. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. So basically, Dan is talking about how she is affected long-term by these, even if she's choosing not to deal with them at the time. I don't want to deal with it. I just get over it. These are all things that we hear when someone is, uses that avoidance as a coping mechanism. It doesn't mean that it didn't affect you. And oftentimes, and I think this is really interesting, especially because my clients are adults. And I would say of all my clients, most of my long-term clients are older adults. So past 30s. So sometimes we don't even realize what an effect it had or what effect it did have until many, many years later. Sometimes we don't even realize it until we have children or are put into a similar situation and then things come up. And it's really important that we deal with them and are able to process them. So here's the cool neuroscience part. Here's where we're going to talk about the ACC, which is the anterior cingulate cortex. And in this part of the brain, feelings from social interactions and physical sensations are combined. So this is also the center where you have focused attention. So as a geeky neuroscientist, two things come up for me when I read that. One is I wonder how much of the ACC is studied when you're looking at adolescence, because this is the point of the brain that is dealing with social interactions, right? And at adolescence and puberty, this is when social interactions become really, really important. And we have significant physical sensations that are occurring, right? Everything from attractiveness to severe embarrassment, trying to read each other's social cues. Do they like me? Do they not like me? What do they think of me? All of those things. So I haven't looked it up. I'm going to bet that there's got to be some connection or some studies that have been done on adolescence in the ACC. And I wonder how developed it is at that point in time. That also leads me to look at ACC when it comes to autism spectrum disorder and any type of attention issues, ADHD, ADD, because not only is it that really hard social interactions, but that focus of attention. So I wonder if, what's going on in the neuroscience there. I'm going to have to look it up. ADD has been studied for a really long time, so I find it really hard to believe that there wouldn't be some good papers out there talking about the link of the ACC to ADD, and I'm just going to use all sorts of letters in this talk. But it would be really interesting to see what they found and if there is a correlation or how you build that up or what the takeaway was. So if you're interested and want to find out whatever I find, please feel free to comment on this video. I will see that. You can also send me a message on my Facebook page, which is also Best Self, Best Health on Facebook or on YouTube. Either place will get to me. Okay, this ACC links body awareness, social interaction, and is the key to connection to ourselves and to others. So it's, an integral part of knowing ourselves, right? Is being able to understand those connections, to really know ourselves so that we can know others. And it's all super cool that it's linked in this one part of the brain. He did talk about the growth of neurons in the ACC during puberty. Like I said, social interactions, body awareness changes. This is the part of the brain that allows us to both think and feel. So again, it's a really interesting one. There's got to be some cool studies, I would think, linking the ACC and seeing with neurodivergent people how that changes. Okay, so Dan also says that by basically deadening all the emotions, this patient basically cut off the wisdom of the body. I thought that was a particularly important phrase. I have tons of books on my to read shelf, and The Body Keeps Score is one of them. And I hope that I eventually will go through that and put that on this channel. But I think that this is a really key statement to talk about embodiment and how important it is to be aware of what's going on in your body, how you cannot just disconnect that from everything else. So he also said that when we're talking about the neuroscience and the physiology of it, that the insula plus the ACC is what gives us our self-awareness. And basically, you cannot ignore the body, right? You have to have insula, you have to have the ACC, and that gives us our complete self-awareness. And basically, for this patient, he is going to focus on interoception and vertical integration. You might remember vertical integration because we talked about that in a previous chapter when he was like going through all the different types of integration you could do. All right, moving on. So interoception, basically, he is saying that we need to monitor and modify the information from the body and then use vertical integration to recognize it. And he was saying, this is interesting to me too. He was saying, in particular, what happens is you can see this very clearly in the patient's inability to access her sympathetic nervous system. So you've heard me talk about sympathetic nervous system a bazillion times. This is where you find your FFF, which is fight, flight, or freeze. And basically, I talk about SNS and trying to flip out of the SNS a lot, right? I talk a lot about how you can bring your parasympathetic nervous system back online so that you don't get stuck in SNS, especially if you're being triggered by a not real threat. However, it's really important to also give thanks to our SNS because it saves lives. Evolutionarily speaking, this was what gave us the motivation to protect ourselves from immediate danger. And although we're not still running away from giant predators or war or anything like that, it still is an integral part of how we listen to ourselves. And there's a great book that I read from my friend, The Gift of Fear. She had recommended to me. It's a great book. It talks a little bit about how that SNS, right, can kind of leak into our body if we're really aware, and even links some of the gut reactions that you feel when you're in fear, where fear comes from, and how we shouldn't ignore, like we always say, listen to your gut reaction. You know, if you're feeling weird in your stomach, there is a reason behind that, and it is linked to your sympathetic nervous system. All right, I digress, but I'll get back. So in this patient, remember, she's basically cut this off. So she has deadened her emotions to her kids, to herself. She doesn't react the same as somebody else who has full integration and awareness. So for him, he says he's going to take the energy and engagement through vertical integration, right? So basically taking the body's information, the energy and information that's down there, the brainstem information that's coming up through there, the limbic input, that's the bottom part of the brain, and bring it up to our, what he sometimes calls upstairs brain, or cortical awareness. And what that's going to do is create vertical integration to reconnect the body and the mind. And he says this should establish the ability to have emotional communication, because she's sorely lacking in that because of the trauma that she had. So he does say, we're going to talk for a minute about emotional communication, which is super interesting. So Dan Siegel says that most people understand big emotions. Like we understand emotions when we're talking about anger or fear or sadness. And he calls these categorical emotions. And he said there's also the underlying emotions. And these emotions he calls primary emotions. And the quote that is so gorgeous is, primary emotions are the music of the mind. I just love that imagery. Forever will be there, that painting of music of the mind. And so his explanation of this is, all the time there is ebbs and flows of energy, right? And with that ebb and flow of energy, there's information. We can sense that flow in every moment of the day. So a lot of times when I or Dan talk about mindful meditation, it is about paying attention to the ebb and flow of that energy. It is becoming aware of the intricacies within there that's going on, even if you're not doing anything. It's even more so when you're participating in an event, but in general, it happens all the time. All right, I gotta switch to my next page. These shifts in that ebb and flow of energy are basically what influences and colors your experience with life. So it changes how you experience something. It can change your perception of something. And his example, which I think is a pretty decent example, is you can notice that, oh my gosh, I have a lot of focus right now, a lot of energy, there's a lot of energy, or, oh my gosh, I'm really in this kind of chill mood right now. I'm more subdued, right? Things are coming at me more slowly. I'm not on a 100-mile-an-hour wheel at this point. You might also realize when you're more alert, when you're sleepy. And he also reminds us that primary emotions, and why would you want to tap into them, is that primary emotions are what happens before these big reactive categorical emotions. So if we can become aware of primary emotions and really focus on them and pay attention to the intensity and our own arousal that's going on when those little bits of primary emotions are occurring, we can almost predict where we're going. This becomes emotional communication. And for me personally, I deal with a lot of parents that are raising challenging children. And I think that what ultimately we're doing is trying to increase emotional communication for everyone involved, both people who are around challenging kids and challenging kids themselves. Schools have caught on to this. So you have actually seen social emotional learning going on. It's SEL, and there's different curriculum and things that different schools use. But that idea of social emotional learning, why it's important, that's what this is. It's emotional communication. It's becoming aware of the nuances of your primary emotions before they're so big and so reactive that it's difficult. I also make a little nuance caveat here. It is not wrong. Sorry. It is not wrong to experience big emotions. We all experience big emotions. It's important to experience big emotions. So becoming in tune with your primary emotions doesn't mean you're never going to experience a big emotion. It just gives you a greater awareness, and it sometimes can give you a little bit of space so that when you're noticing a shift in your primary emotions and you're aware that you're headed towards a categorical emotion, it can give you enough space in there to utilize some tools. And that really is what it's all about, because you want to be able to use tools, whether that's tools that will help you if you're super angry or super sad, right? You can feel those emotions coming on, or super fearful. Really important to kind of have our own toolbox of what works for us, and have enough time and awareness between, all these things are kind of shifting. Where is that leading me? I have a little bit of space. What tools do I need to pull out right now before the big thing happens, so that I'm prepared when the big thing happens? So it's not stopping that big thing from happening. It's allowing you to be better prepared and aligned within yourself when that big thing happens. All right, I'm getting off on my own tangent, so I'm getting back to Dan. Okay. He says, primary emotions happen more often than categorical emotions. Obviously, we talked a little bit about that. And we can connect to our internal worlds by being aware of the levels of those emotions. Again, you end up knowing yourself so well, you can kind of feel the shifts. You sense that ebb and flow. And again, Mindsight, his philosophy, this kind of overreaching philosophy that he has developed, basically gives us the awareness to look at this. It allows us, for example, to realize the difference between I'm a little bit tired and I'm exhausted, and to see the shifts that are getting in between there. So, I'm just going through and make sure I covered all this. I was talking about internal family systems, which is a different kind of categorical way to look at neuroscience, emotions, trauma, and how you deal with it, the embodiment. And in that realm, we would talk about this ability of being aware allows you to really hone in on your true self, so that when you're going through the emotions, that you're reacting in an alignment with your true self and not any bit of ways that you might cope maladaptively. All right. He also says you cannot connect with others unless you connect with yourself, which every old adage and you've ever heard of, you have to love yourself before you can love others. It's true. Basically, that's what he's saying. And Then he's going to get back to his patient. So remember, she's basically, by disconnecting, she's taken the meaning out of her life, which that was really hard for me to hear, because when you take out meaning, you take out beauty, right? You take out all of the things that make it worthwhile. You're just going through the motions, right? And so he does talk about what is going on. She has basically her limbic system, which is the system that he talks about earlier on, about this is the part of your brain that looks and evaluates things like, this is good, this is bad, this is relevant, this is irrelevant, this is how I feel about this one. So that I'm going to be more likely to do this one more often or pay more attention to this. That gives us drive. That gives us gratitude and appreciation. That gives us motivation to do things. And when you don't have that, it really puts you at a huge disadvantage for experiencing life. So he does talk about triggers in this chapter, and he says, you are going to create defenses whether or not you are aware of them. And this ties into the next chapter, which should go up as soon as I post this one, or soon after. Basically, that when something occurs, your brain doesn't just ignore it, right? Especially if it's traumatic. Your brain figures out a way to deal with it in the best way that it can figure out. When people don't have strong support systems, they don't have a strong attachment system, for example, when they're young, or even when they're older, what happens is the brain just figures out the best way to do that. And you've seen maladaptive ways. I mean, eating is one of them, right? People who are emotional eaters. I'm one of them. Right? Like, it's not a healthy way, but it is a way that the brain figures out how to deal with emotions. This is how it's going to deal with them. And if you don't figure that out eventually, you can end up in really terrible situations. He does say, even if you're not aware of them, they can happen from early childhood. And he reviews the fact that what happens is, for a trigger to happen, there's a trigger, there's an emotion. All right? Something triggers you, you have an emotion, even if you're not fully aware. Then you have a reaction. A lot of times that reaction is fear or anxiety. And then you have a defense. Some action that you take. A lot of times it's shut down. Avoidant. In this case, it was complete shutdown and avoidance, right? So that she didn't have to deal with any of it. And he says there are 3 things you can do to shut down, because your brain is like, shut that down. We're not dealing with that. We don't have the ability. You can talk yourself out of things rationally. You can ignore things completely. And I put a little note on that. Ooh, some people do this and then they frame it as optimism. So the people who are never pay attention to bad things or evaluate them as bad, that's actually a defense mechanism, right? If you don't deal with hard things in life or difficult things in life or evaluate them as, that was really hard, you're basically ignoring them. All right, projection. So you can actually give that to someone else. If you have some sort of crazy fear, a lot of times your brain doesn't want to deal with it, so you project it onto somebody else, and then you can deal with that person as like, oh, well, they're the person who has an addiction, or they're the person who has an eating problem, or they're the person, whatever it might be. And he does say that trauma is when this occurs, right, significantly, and through the trauma, your defense may have worked to save you from that trauma at that time. However, since you carry things forward and it affects you, it is time to get into a safe place and really process and heal. And that's what he's going to talk about here. So he talks about, a window of tolerance. So like inside that window frame would be awareness, that you're aware of that, right? And tolerating things. And that frame is actually what is going to be your reactive state, right? So you have your tolerance and your awareness, and you build a frame around it. And if anything starts to push out towards that frame, that's when you get reactive, okay? Some people talk about this, right? Like the window of tolerance and the ability to like increase or decrease that when you do trauma related stuff. They talk about that. And in Dan's world, he talks about this. I'm probably skipping ahead. He does talk about this later on, about widening that window of tolerance and how that reactive state, basically, we want to increase what's on the inside and make that reactive state like a little less reactive, right? So right now, if you only are tolerant that much, then it hits the frame, you're reactive. And so his plan is to increase that window so that you have more awareness and more tolerance. All right. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. See, so many notes because he's so wonderful. It's such a great book. All right. Okay. So now we're going to get to the portion of the chapter where he's talking about his specific methods that he's used with this patient, why he's used them, and how they're kind of going to work through her main issue. So first of all, he's going to use mindfulness, which is a focused awareness. And here's the cool, I should say, neuroscience geek alert. He explains it like this. When you have focused attention on something, what goes on in your brain is that your brain secretes acetylcholine. And when acetylcholine goes in and coats all of your brain, it modulates your brain to increase neuroplasticity. And when he's dealing with someone who has such an ingrained neural pathway, right? Because she's done this neural pathway for many, many years, decades, in fact. What he needs to do is he needs to tap into the neuroplasticity of the brain to unlearn the unhelpful pattern and then teach the brain a new pathway, right? Create new synapses in a healthier pathway. And that is all starts with mindfulness, focused attention, acetylcholine, coating it and making it able to do those things so that you don't have a rigid brain that says, nope, I'm not going to do it. Nope, this is the path. I only know that one path. So now I'm going to talk about some of the techniques. If you want to know more about these techniques, I'm sure that he has examples on his website. I haven't been in a while, but I know that oftentimes he will put out examples of them. Some of these you might already be familiar with. So first, his go-to is a body scan. Now, if you've done any mindfulness meditations, if you are on Headspace or Calm or 10% happiness, happier, they oftentimes will do a meditative guided meditation in a body scan. And what you're normally doing, sometimes they go from head to feet. A lot of times they go from feet to head because you're in a relaxed state. There is like this caveat and this generally acknowledged thing that as you move up the body in a body scan and you're paying attention to anything that might be coming up, a lot of people, when they get to the pelvis area, get uncomfortable emotionally. So your pelvis really is an embodiment of emotion. And I found this really interesting because I do yoga as well. And I have several friends who are certified yoga instructors, and they will tell you if they're doing a session that is really focused on pelvic work, whether you're in child's pose a lot, you're doing pigeon, you're opening up the pelvis, they will often find that their students, when they go into shavasana at the end and are kind of like in this calm state, a lot of emotions come out. So there have been tons of times where there are people crying in yoga, not out of pain, right? It's not out of pain. It's literally out of the fact that they've hit this emotional point. In his example, he was doing a body scan with his client, and she got up to her chest and then said, stop. Now, he didn't say this, but I find that really interesting because your chest and your heart and the emotions of losing a mom and grief, a lot of times people will say, it's heavy in my chest. And I found that really interesting that that's where she stopped. She was so upset and did not want to move forward that she insisted that they stop. And Dan, being in touch, really was in tune with her and able to stop there and said, we won't go any further. And so he tried other things to get her prepared to deal with that. Obviously, she wasn't quite ready to deal with that. He introduced things like finger releasing. He also did a lot of safe space work. And this can be a place where a person is thinking about a safe place, and that could be real or imaginary. It might be something from a memory, or it might be their current home where they could picture themselves and they feel the most secure. And then he was having her go to this safe space and start talking about internal sensations, her body sensations, describing them. Like if you were to go through your body in this safe space, you know, what's it feel like? And it's incredible. She would talk about her breath, and she could feel her breath slowing. She could talk about her abdomen softening up and being really soft. And then he would have her do exercises where she would tense different muscle groups, oftentimes starting at the bottom, like a body scan at the feet, and moving up slowly, releasing, tensing, releasing, tensing, releasing. He also did bilateral integration, and we talked about this a couple of chapters ago, but he did listening to alternating sounds on the left and the right. And he also did tapping exercises where you tap on the left and the right, going back and forth. Basically, all of those were increasing sensitivity, right? And allowing her to be aware, right? If I'm increasing sensitivity and she's paying attention to that, she's becoming aware of what it feels like in her body. He also did this, and I have never heard of this before, but he did this, I'm going to call it color therapy, but I'm sure it has a name, where he had different colored lenses of glasses. I've seen them before, but he had her try them on, and she would look and kind of take in everything with one color lens and then describe how she's feeling. And different colors change your perception. They evoke different emotions to come up, even looking at the same space. So it's not like she was walking from one place to another. It was the same space, but changing the color of lenses. So I'm definitely want to try those. If you have tried color therapy, it reminds me a lot of music therapy, along those lines of how easily our senses can change our perception and our feelings. I think it's fascinating. So I would love to hear if you have done that, to post below or message me, because I think that's just fascinating. And this is where he comes in and he says, all of those things are ways that I was increasing her tolerance. Her window of tolerance was increasing. And I can't remember if we talked about it in this book, but I know I've talked about on my channel before about Dan's idea of rigidity and chaos. And so what he says is, if you think about tolerance as a river, right, where you're flowing down the river and in general, you're just tolerating everything. There's nothing like crazy. But one side of the river, the bank, is rigidity, and one side is chaos. And what happens if we have a really small stream, it's really easy to start bumping into rigidity or chaos, right? We go either way. Sometimes we go back and forth. Sometimes we get stuck for a long time in one. And if we can increase the window of tolerance, you widen that river. So you're finding yourself less stuck in rigidity or chaos. And basically, when that happens, he says that being present is the biggest thing you can do to widen that window. And thus why all of those exercises and mindfulness is really important, because it keeps you present. Sorry if you hear my dogs in the background. The last thing he talks about a little bit in here, which I loved, was he talked about mirror neurons and how important mirror neurons are to be aware of, both within yourself and with people that you work with. I would say also with your children. And what happens is you get to influence others and they influence you back. And it's not conscious. So I use this a lot when I talk about co-regulation with kids. Kids at a young age are not able to regulate and get themselves back situated. So in order to regulate their emotions, they need co-regulation techniques. And why this works is mirror neurons. If you are with someone who you trust and you feel safe with, you will find that you mirror them in many things. One is the breath. So if you take slow, deep breaths, they take slow, deep breaths. Your brain automatically does this. If you talk in a slow manner, they will start to talk in a slow manner. You will have this mirroring back and forth. What it can do is amazing, because it can calm people. It also makes people feel felt. When your mirror neurons are activated with someone else, you truly feel that other person in you, and vice versa. And so that when we talk about child development, a lot of times we talk about the need to feel felt, not just heard, but felt. And mirror neurons are what does that. So she was safe space with Dan. They weren't scary. And he did go back and do the body scan again. And she did the whole thing. It was fantastic. And what she found was that integration really changed her whole meaning of life. She could reconnect with her maternal grandparents. She found a picture and actually went through the processes of emotion that her mother would have felt. She no longer felt empty of emotion. She could feel all the emotion. I mean, really, for me, there's nothing better, because when you experience life like that, that's true happiness. And I can't tell you how powerful that is, to think that he helped someone do that. So beautiful. All right. That is chapter what did I say? Chapter 7, cut off from the neck down. And I will be back with chapter 8.